everyone. And I want to sort of, I think I'm going to sort of preface what I'm saying in with a few observations. So first, I'm not going to deal line by line with everything that has been presented, right? I am going to make a few observations about what I saw presented, as well as some of the budget documents that were released thereafter the finance minister's presentation. So I think to sort of outline basically what a budget or national budget does is that it sets priorities about what the government intends to do and how it intends to utilize resources to meet certain sort of national needs, right? So I think that has to be made clear as to, and I think that's very, very important for us to understand how that impacts each of us and how it impacts the larger sort of masses of population as a whole, right? So by outlining sort of what these priorities are in terms of how it's going to sort of allocate resources for the next sort of fiscal year, I think it has to be, it's very ironic that the Guardian newspaper this morning is pointing out that this is a rich man's budget, right? I say it's ironic because the Guardian media is owned by very wealthy people. But the point about that is that I think it's not, in a number of ways, the budget is not forward looking. It's very much, it focuses on how the country has arrived at where we're at in terms of a focus on gas and oil. And in a sense, it's very mediocre in not orienting the society towards where we want to go as a country and what are the sort of values and what are the priorities that we want to focus on as a society in changing and using the opportunity, unfortunately, that COVID has provided to change direction, right? So I've said before, and I think the budget has illustrated this very well, this is one of the most callous and one of the most neoliberal governments that the country has ever seen, right? So the increase, I think, Comrade Roger has pointed out, the increase in oil, the increase in fuel prices again, during a time when many people have suffered as a result of COVID and has suffered on the sort of back end of COVID due to loss of their jobs, due to increase in inflation and prices when they go to the supermarket and so on, show us that the government is following an ideology, right? And the ideology that we're talking about is its focus on transferring wealth to the groups of people in our society who do not need it, right? Those who are profiting off of exploiting our resources, right? And it continues the pattern, I think, that we've seen over the past few years with this particular government in terms of its focus on those groups of people, thinking that there's some sort of trickle-down effect. When you enrich people at the top, it trickles down to the rest of society, which is an absolute lie and a myth. So, second, I think the issue around, a lot of the time when we have national budgets presented, the newspapers and media focus on these headline budgetary allocations. So we talk about education getting this amount of $1 billion, and healthcare getting this amount of $1 billion, and national security and so on. The issue with that is that there's very little analysis of the substance of what that means, and in the historical moment that we're at, in terms of what these allocations mean for regular people. So I want to break that down a little. I think over the past few years, we have seen, one, this government has engaged in a large effort at union busting, right? It has engaged in an effort at privatization. It has engaged in an effort of corporatization of the state sector, right? So when people say the public sector is inefficient, they do not actually focus on the fact that the government has privatized a large part of the government sector, which essentially means that it has contracted out a large amount of public services, right? So when we talk about these headline numbers being this billion and that billion, what essentially is happening is that transfer of wealth is happening, right? So when you have a large number of contractors and private enterprise working in many of these sectors, essentially the government is prioritizing offering more and more profit to those businesses which do not, in many instances, prioritize the public interest. They prioritize getting the most out of those funds, right, and most of out of those allocations, but they do not, to a large extent, prioritize job creation. They do not prioritize social welfare. They do not prioritize increasing minimum wage. That's what the role the government is supposed to do, right? However, it has very much focused on how to give back to those businesses and private interests, which in some ways it has very close ties. I think one other point that has to be made is that how much more can the patrimony of the country be given away to transnational companies, right? I've been paying attention to things that the CEO of the Energy Chamber has been saying regarding increases in tax incentives and so on. What this essentially means is that our natural resources, and for a long time this has been the case, our natural resources have not been used and increasingly is not being used for the upliftment of people and for the upliftment of regular people who require support in terms of increased education, right? So when we talk about these $50 million going towards remedial programs in education, or this large chunk going towards education, it does not actually speak to how the quality of education is what is the quality of education to our citizens and young people, right? It also does not address the long-standing problems around political education that is required for society to evolve, right? And the kinds of education that ensure that people are fully aware of their history, fully aware of what government role is supposed to be, and so on. It really does not attend to where we want our society to go. And I think that is a large part of what has happened. So I'm going to end on one further point, right? The issue around offering public servants or offering healthcare workers a one-off payment, right? In addition to which offering $1,000 in a way to try to compensate for the increase in inflation is really an attempt to mama guy people and to fool people in believing that the government is actually addressing some of their problems. So I want to take the example of what's happening in Barbados. So what has happened, we've seen that Barbados, and this is being used as a cudgel and a hoax to fool people about the fear of going to the IMF, right? The government, in the speech, you can see government mention fiscal consolidation a number of times. Essentially, what that means is that government is reducing spending and to a large extent is following the IMF protocol without actually going to the IMF. I want to make that clear. The tenets and the priorities and ideology of the IMF is to reduce what goes out to regular people, the amount of funding that goes to people through state and public employment, through welfare programs, through education, and so on, and essentially reduce those aspects of the national priorities and resources to the people sector, we can call it, and ensure that the government is spending much less than it should be in order to sort of uplift those sectors. The government is actually going to the IMF without actually going to the IMF, right? So what has happened in Barbados as a result of the inflationary pressures globally we're experiencing, is that the Barbadian government has put a price cap on fuel prices. They have put a price cap on a number of essential items that people have to purchase. This government is deciding to increase those prices, right? And suggesting that this is a way to avoid going to the IMF, which is absolutely not true. There are mechanisms in place and measures that the government can take to ensure that people who are really, really suffering at this particular point in time as a result of COVID can continue to receive some kind of benefits and continue living their lives and ensuring that they meet their needs, but it's willingly and deliberately deciding not to do that. So I'm going to end there. Thanks very much.